Sorry about that. This is part two now, rhetorical analysis. Sorry, I had crazy dog going nuts, of course. So this is going to be the second section of our lecture for week 7. This section is looking at the rhetorical devices. In the first half of the video that I cut off when the dog started barking, we talked about kairos. This section we're talking about devices. Rhetorical devices are stylistics used for a specific audience, a particular audience in mind, so that you can demonstrate your authority in order for that particular audience to give you authority. So in a way, you're showing off and you're doubling down on your petition to that audience to give you full authority in order to be persuaded. You can see this in politics, especially the devices use the stylistics. For example, President Trump relies on hyperbole a lot in his speeches, and Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, relies a lot on imagery and word pictures and metaphors. So you can see these kind of elements playing out in real time when you look at politics. You can see these in some advertisements, and you guys were all over that in your advertisement exercises. So specifically when we look at rhetorical devices, it's the stylistics that decorate your appeal, your persuasion. So appeals to logic, ethos, and pathos are the strategies you're using, the tone you're taking. So I'm going to approach something if I'm using an appeal to logic, or I'm going to look at providing reasoned argument and evidence, and if I'm using an appeal to pathos or emotion, I'm going to shade my language to have infusions of emotion. So when you look at devices, devices can be grouped by the type of appeal as well as the type of device. By appeal, you can look at devices under emotional appeal or pathetic appeal. Some specific devices used are sarcasm or lament. Lament is when you're, remember how great things were back in the day. You're feeling sad by something. Apostrophe is when somebody appeals to the gods or to an authority figure. You see this in Greek plays, especially. Oh, Zeus! I appeal to you, Zeus, or appealing to authority. You see this a lot in prayer or in ministerial work. Commiseration. You and I are in the same boat, fella. We're both in Joe Biden example of that is when he's trying to commiserate with families about the COVID virus. We're in the same boat here. An ethical appeal, the devices that might be specific to an ethical appeal might be things like analogies, where you're comparing two things in some way. You're using one thing to prove another in an analogy by bringing similar situations and making that connection for your audience. Or allusion, not illusion, but ALLUSION. Allusion is when you appeal to a culture's knowledge base of knowledge, so that there's a shared cultural connection or item of knowledge. For example, if I say to you, the Bible tells me so, because the United States is based on Western civilization, it's a Christian Judeo tradition. The Bible is at the center of that Christian and some sense of the Judeo tradition. But if I said to you, if we were in, for example, Indonesia, which can either be Hindu or Muslim primarily, if I said the Bible, it wouldn't have that same cultural meaning, and so that allusion might fall short. And if I'm making an ethical appeal and the allusion falls short, then I've lost that authority. I've lost that appeal, the strength of that appeal. Allusion might also be between history. So if I say, as Shakespeare said, well, he's canonical to Western British literature. If you're in that tradition, Americans have that as well. But if I said Shakespeare to someone who is from one of the African countries, it might not hold the same meaning or depth of meaning where we revere Shakespeare as a great writer, but what if he doesn't have that same connection to a culture? And finally, logic. When we look at a logical appeal, King is specifically good about establishing his credibility, his authority, by using balance and conditionals. Balance is when you have two sides of a sentence and they're equally weighted. So one might be if this, then this, that could be a balance. And that's also a conditional. If, then, but, for, those kind of one leads to another logically. And that balance, you'll see this when he says, threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He's doing that balance and making that connection. He also uses the conditional extremely well. If this, then this. If this, then this. But for, threading through. And when he starts his letter off, when he says, "You accuse me of being unwise and untimely," then he starts right in by using the language of time and wisdom and weaving that through the rest of his paragraphs, but specifically heavily lading words of time and wisdom into that first section where he addresses specific charges of untimely and unwise. So specific devices, and I'll have a list up on D2L, and it's also, I have a section of it at the bottom of the Rhetoric PowerPoint, but wanting to think about devices, they're meant to decorate the text or your argument in order to boost the persuasiveness of the appeal. They're used to divert attention from flaws as well. So if you know that your argument is not as strong in some areas, you can do a sleight of word instead of sleight of hand. You can do sleight of word in some way to try to laden on your skill with wordcraft where you might not have the strength of an argument in itself. You underscore your own credibility, and you can also get greater authority and control. You can clarify through your devices. Most commonly recognized devices, you've known these since high school, are metaphors using comparisons, imagery, which are word pictures. There's rhyme. You see that in poetry and children's literature, Dr. Seuss, which is on the menu for next week. And alliteration. Alliteration is when you have the first letter of a word repeat. So the sneaky snake slithers in the grass, the repetition of the S sound. Repetitions in themselves, if you keep, green eggs and ham, perfect example in Dr. Seuss. I will not eat them here or there, or will not eat them anywhere. I do not like them, Sam, I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. And that repetition constantly is honing your point across over and over. Subtler devices that we see are conjuries, that's heaping on. You see for example, in green eggs and ham, the conjury, will you eat them here, will you eat them there, with the box, with the fox, on the boat, with the goat, on and on and on. That conjury, the saturation. What is that saturation doing as a device? Allusions, we just talked about allusions. Interpolation is when you call somebody in to a belief system, when you're calling to them in some way. If you are calling the wrong group, they won't respond. You'll shut down your authority. Brevity, I'm never brief in my speaking, my writing, but if you see brevity, what is that doing? Or amplification, that's another way. You might think about aperture. When you see something is focusing on a huge wide aperture, the panoramic view in a sense, or if it's of close narrow focus. Balance, we talked about. Conditionals, we talked about. Crisscrossing, where you do one repeated here and there and then cross it this way. So those are some of the rhetorical devices, and I'll put the rest of the things up on D2L as a list. But you're certainly welcome for your rhetorical analysis to look at specific devices if you're interested in doing a comparison between how, for example, King uses maybe how he uses imagery versus how Dr. Seuss uses imagery, or how King uses appeals versus how Seuss uses appeals. You can look at that as your rhetorical analysis, or if you want to do critical analysis, looking at how they structure their arguments. And then the last thing I want to talk about tonight is that Joanne Chula's argument, Habits and Virtues, about why it should matter if a leader kicks a dog. And it's an incredibly well-written argument. It's a classic example of a strong academic argument. I put it in our reading because I wanted you to see a few things as you're going into your proposals for your final paper and structuring out for your annotated bibliography, getting ready to start into your research. One of the things I wanted to call attention is I wanted you to notice her abstract and the keywords at the front part of her article. That's typical for an APA style paper. She is a psychology professor at Rutgers, and she is using APA styling for that specific format. But within her citation and her works cited at the end, she's using a Chicago style of formatting. It's certainly fine for this class. I'm supposed to teach you MLA formatting, make sure that you understand that, but I want you to feel free to use the formatting you are most comfortable with and that you will have the most use for in your studies. For example, if you're in nursing program, or going into any kind of psychology, social sciences, and the APA is something you'll use most often, then feel free to use that format for your papers. I'm not going to jam you up and say, it's not an MLA format. That's not important. The important thing is you're consistent and that you are using whatever format well. I wanted you to see when Joanne Chula is citing in her argument, she's using endnotes, and she's using those in Chicago style. She's also using a bibliography, which is also considered a Chicago format style. A bibliography comprises all of the research you did to put into the paper. It's not just the articles that you've cited or the information you've cited, but all of the influence going into that paper. And APA style uses the word references or resources. They don't use bibliography, but this is a great article to look at to see how she's using formatting and citation. I also wanted to show you in her bibliography, look at the credibility of the sources that she uses. It's a typical academic paper where she relies on fellow academics. She's relying on journals and peer-reviewed works. She's using books that are written by scholars. She's not using a lot of online sources, but when she does, she's using a source that is credible and authoritative, and we'll cover that in later classes, but she's got a good example of a format. But going into her argument, look at how she relies on devices versus how King relies on devices versus how Dr. Seuss in the Sneetches, which we'll be reading for next Sunday. Look at how each of them uses rhetorical devices and consider why. Why is King using heavy on his rhetorical devices, and why? Why does he need to use those specific devices and use them so heavily for his specific audience? And then think about King versus Seuss. Why is Seuss fairly light on his devices, but he uses them specifically for his target audience, like for rhyme and rhythm for children, because it gets them interested in listening or helps them go to sleep if that's your use for Dr. Seuss. But then think about Joanne Chula is very light on her use of rhetorical devices. She's not decorating her argument very much at all, but she does use an appeal to logic, and then she shifts beautifully. She uses that logical appeal to turn on ethos, the concept of ethos and ethics, virtue, because that's what her topic is about, and then she spins it to use ethics, an appeal to ethos, to discuss ethics as well. So she uses that appeal to logic to shift to the appeal to ethos by using ethos itself. She uses a very little bit of appealing to emotion and think about who her audience might be. So why is she using those devices that she uses minimally, and why does she use the appeal to emotion so minimally? So thinking about all those things when you're writing your rhetorical analysis, you're certainly welcome to integrate all of these things into that rhetorical analysis you're constructing. Or you can simply do a critical analysis and dabble in a little bit and say, the structure is really strong in this text and the devices work beautifully in this way, or the devices are at odds with what they're doing with their thesis and get in the way of proving their argument. You can mix and match. But feel free to dig in. I'm loving your writing. It's beautiful. It's such a treat to read all of your work. It's almost as if I'm being asked to read professional writing instead of trying to assess somebody to help them become a better writer. I'm learning from you because your writing is so strong and beautiful. Keep that up. Let me know if you have any questions. I apologize for the break in the videos. Obviously, I've got crazy terriers, but I'm not a crazy cat lady yet. Crazy terrier lady. Again, let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a wonderful week.